Good morning. We are going to talk about Italian neorealism today. Let me begin with a brief background of Italian cinema. So, in 1905, the first Italian studios were built, owned by two of the largest production companies, Cines and Itala. So, both of these, remember, were film production companies, both of which made successful costume dramas. You do recall what's a costume drama, right? We are talking about period pieces, epics, almost in the vein of let us say the 10 Commandments or Ben-Hur. So, those were costume dramas, big budgeted spectacular films. Some of the famous films of this category were The Last Day of Pompeii, The Fall of Troy, which was made in 1910, and Cabiria, which was released in 1914. Now, let me tell you something about Cabiria. Cabiria is a story of a slave girl, and for those days it was a mammoth production. It took 6 months to shoot the movie in studios. Sets were constructed to shoot the movie, as well as parts of the movie were shot on locations. It was also considered extremely innovative for those times, because it contained dolly and crane shots. Some of you will be doing discussions of key concepts in cinema. So, you should know what are dolly shots and crane shots. Let me write it for those who are watching it online. These are the concepts that you should be knowing. And the film's success, remember we are talking about the costume drama. So, the film success in the US inspired people like D.W. Griffith. Remember who he was? Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. So, we have already talked about he was one of the great pioneers of filmmaking in the US. And along with D.W. Griffith, another US producer director who got inspired by the success of Cabiria was Cecil B. DeMille. And you are of course by now familiar with the works of Cecil B. DeMille. And these two Hollywood producers were inspired to launch big budget productions, and much of the credit goes to Cabiria. Now, let me read out an excerpt from Pam Cook's The Cinema book, where Richard Dyer talks about Cabiria. So, this is what he says: Cabiria exemplifies the fusion of epic and spectacle in Italian silent cinema. It is epic in its large scale rendering of world historical events. And what are those events that he is talking about? The eruption of Mount Etna, Hannibal's challenge to Rome, Scipio's defeat of Carthage, and Archimedes' invention of fire weapons, and of individual characters caught up in and made great by them. The heroes alert the Romans of Hannibal's advance, and their rescue of the child Cabiria from sacrifice to the god Moloch is emblematic of Roman chivalry and Carthaginian savagery. The presentation of the two heroes, patrician Fulvio and brawny Macete, deploys statuesque postures and ennobling framing, opening with shots of them singled out as men of destiny on a rocky promontory by the sea. Yet it was the slave Macete who was to become the popular hero figure in a series of subsequent films, although in the process shedding his black identity. Cabiria is spectacular in its sensuously overwhelming visual quality. The massive sets have a solidity staggering in comparison with both stage sets and later special effects and computer generated constructions of the ancient world. The scale is emphasized by canted angles that dwarf the humans, pans that indicate expanse, and forward tracking shots that draw the viewer in. Design pits the clean lines, open spaces and white and martial clothes of Rome against the Orientalist decadent languor of Carthage, where the screen is crowded with ornate furnishing, sumptuous fabrics and furs. The spectacle of suffering is dwelt on in the whipping of Cabiria's nurse Croessa, Masters chained to a millstone, and above all the god Moloch, a vast statue with a giant mouth, into whose flames children are tossed. In short, Cabiria, in a bland characteristic of Italian cinema, welds together in equal measure antique ideals, stylish design, sensuous pleasures and sensual energies. So, high praise coming from Richard Dyer on Cabiria. And if you pay attention to what I have just said, then you can draw parallels between especially Cecil de Mille's cinema and this kind of cinema that Cabiria is all about. So, the First World War and the competition from the US put an end to the large scale production. So, we are talking about evolution of Italian cinema from huge productions, big budget productions after the First World War, and stiff competition from the US, and Italian cinema and Italian film industry was in a state of transition, and it put an end to the large scale productions. However, and it is very ironic, it was the fascist regime under Mussolini that revived Italian cinema. Now, Mussolini 1883 to 1945, unlike Hitler or Stalin, he did not aim at total control over the content or style of the Italian commercial cinema. See, remember, Hitler had someone like Goebbels, who was his propaganda minister, and we have already talked about a film like Triumph of Will, which was nothing less than a propaganda film for Hitler, where Hitler is portrayed in very flattering light, in very almost he is deified, but that was not Mussolini at all. He did not aim at total control over the content or style of the Italian cinema. For propaganda reasons, Mussolini preferred documentary films and newsreel films produced by LUCE, and perhaps you would like to note down the acronym. It is an acronym, and perhaps you would like to note down the full form of this acronym: L'Unione Cinematografica Educativa, LUCE. So, this body produced documentary films which Mussolini used for propaganda reasons. The fascist regime viewed Hollywood as its model and saw cinema, and we are talking about the commercial kind of cinema, more as entertainment than as a vehicle for propaganda. So, there was a divide. Documentary films were used for propaganda, whereas more commercial kind of cinema was viewed more like a means of entertainment, almost like popular Hollywood cinema. Thus, during fascism, the industry remained relatively free to pursue filmmaking without facing interference from the government, and this is a key element of Italian cinema. In spite of having a fascist regime, the industry was relatively free to pursue their kind of cinema, and there was not much of an interference from the government. Another key aspect that you should know about Italian cinema of this period is popularly and very derisively called the cinema of the white telephone. You know, rich people had white telephones in their films, and they had a particular kind of mise en scène we have been talking about. So, one aspect of mise en scène for showing lives of the rich and the elites in Italian cinema was to show you know, it is an object, the white telephone, and if it is a white telephone, we have to assume of course all the props and all the trappings of rich man's house would always be there, but a white telephone house, a white telephone necessarily signified that we are looking at a very affluent kind of a family. So, cinema of the white telephone variety, and in the 30s Italian cinema was dominated by this kind of cinema. These were light-hearted, flimsy films about the wealthy in Italy. I mean, I can give you several examples of white telephone cinema from Hollywood also. Think of all those films starring Rock Hudson and Doris Day, Pillow Talk, and Rock Hudson and Gina Lollobrigida, Come September. So, these movies are popularly termed as the white telephone kind of cinema. Send Me No Flowers, again starring Rock Hudson and Doris Day. In fact, Doris Day had come to signify this very light-hearted, flimsy kind of cinema. In Hollywood we are talking about. So, however, even during this time in Italy there were exceptions, and there was a movie titled very interestingly, What Scoundrels Men Are, released in 1932, and the distinction, it has the distinction of being the first Italian film to be shot entirely on location. So, this is something that we are going to discuss subsequently, that how important having non-professional actors, you know, non-trained actors, people who had never acted before, and shooting on location and in natural lights and having natural sounds, those were such important aspects of Italian neorealism. And then we also talk about French New Wave cinema and the new Hollywood cinema. So, we, you know, there is a kind of a set pattern. In 1935, the fascist regime founded a major film school, the Centro Sperimental di Cinematografica. So, it is a film school, and it was founded by the Italian regime, the fascist regime. In 1937, Mussolini inaugurated a film complex, it was called Cinecittà. Okay. So, two major breakthrough events happening by way of giving encouragement to films. One was foundation of a film school, and another was inauguration of a film complex. And then interestingly, Mussolini's son, Vittorio Mussolini, he launched a journal and became an editor for a film journal called Cinema. And this Cinema was interested in international films and also in understanding theories and techniques behind quality cinema. So, launching of a film journal, and later perhaps you may draw parallels between this and Cahiers du Cinema in France during the French New Wave. Another key film director of this period was Alessandro Blasitti, who in 1942 made a film called Four Steps in the Cloud, a movie that sort of anticipated the entire neo-realist film movement. And why do we say that? Blasitti used humble characters coming from ordinary backgrounds. So, this is not the white telephone kind of cinema anymore. This is not the costume drama anymore. So, Blasitti's cinema, commercial, yes, but still used more humble characters coming from humble background, sort of anticipated the kind of cinema that today we know as the neo-realist cinema. Another significant film by Blasitti was 1860, which was a patriotic drama, and Blasitti is associated with this kind of cinema. In 1940, Augusto Janina directed a movie called The Siege of Alcazar, which celebrates the defense of the fortress in Toledo during the Spanish Civil War by Franco's fascists, General Franco, okay, and defense of the fortress in Toledo during the Spanish Civil War. So, taking a slice of history and making a movie, Siege of Alcazar. This movie, and this is significant, was made in the style of a fictional documentary. This is another key concept that you should know. Fictional documentary, it is called documentario romanzato. It is a fictional documentary. Now, what are the attributes of a fictional documentary? The fictional documentary style generally meant adding a romantic subplot or love story to the plot, majorly centered on heroic adventures, military conquers or war, and adding a love story. Okay, so, a blend of fiction and also something that really happened, a historical account of a military conquest or an adventure that really took place. But fictional documentary, the name suggests what these movies were really all about. So, this kind of hybrid plot became a typical part of post-war neo-realist cinema, fictional documentary. The most significant documentaries shot for the Italian armed forces were, one was directed by Francesco de Robertis. It was called Men on the Bottom, 1940. So, it was a documentary and it was shot for the Italian armed forces. And the Robertis is important to us because he mentored Roberto Rossellini, and we are going to look at the relevance, the importance of Roberto Rossellini towards the entire neo-realist movement, neo-realism in Italy. Leo Longanesi, this is another key name that you should know, you should be familiar with. He was a journalist and staunch supporter of Mussolini. He gave the motto, Mussolini is always right. Longanesi, like Cesare Zavattini after him, he anticipates Cesare Zavattini, and we are going to see, look in detail who Zavattini was and who he collaborated with. So, Longanesi advocated extremely simple realistic films without elaborate sets. So, that was the contribution of Longanesi. So, almost anticipated, he was a precursor to staunch Neorealists like Zavattini, who was a Marxist intellectual. With the fall of Mussolini and the end of the war, international audiences were suddenly introduced to Italian films through the works of Rossellini, De Sica and Visconti. So, these are the names which are at the center of Italian Neorealist cinema: Rossellini, De Sica and Visconti. Italian directors now combine the desire for cinematic realism with social, political or economic themes that would not have worked under the regime. See, you are not supposed to criticize the regime. Mussolini, as we know, he did not interfere. He did not want the popular commercial Italian cinema to be a vehicle for his ideas. He did not turn cinema into a kind of propaganda, but still there were certain limitations, there were certain taboos, and that was the government should not be criticized, society should not be vehemently criticized. But once the fascist regime came to an end, cinema was free from such constraints, and directors started depicting those social and political and economic themes which could not be realized during the fascist regime. So, that was one upshot of the fall of the fascist government. So, Neorealism generally refers to films of working class life, generally which are set in abysmal poverty. This movement tapped into a particular transition in Italian life and became a vehicle for filmmakers interested in vivid description of history and society. The underlying message in the films is that in a better society, wealth would be more evenly distributed. So, now you get the sense that it is more about the socialist concept of politics, that wealth, there should be an equal and equitable distribution of wealth among people in society. Often these films would be based on true incidents and used newsreel footage. This is a very common practice, at least nowadays, to use newsreel footage. Think even a movie like Forrest Gump, which is pretty mainstream, but uses newsreel footage from the times of the President Kennedy. So, but it all started from during the Neorealism period in Italy. So, there were those movies were shot on actual locations, just like the French New Wave films, and used non-professional actors. So, this is something that we have been talking about quite frequently in this course, insistence by a certain kind of filmmakers on non-professional actors. Now, if you think of classic Hollywood, if you think of high concept films, which is an area that we will soon be talking about. So, what happens in high concept and classic Hollywood films? Insistence on an emphasis on stars, okay. But the more realistic the cinema, the more emphasis on natural acting and use of non-professional actors. All these great directors, for example, Bresson, Dreyer and the directors from the French New Wave movement, they all insisted on using non-professional actors, and our own recent Dogme manifesto from Denmark, they too, that is a part of their manifesto, to use non-professional actors and also using natural lights, the use of natural lights, sync sound as opposed to dubbed sound. Okay, so, all these features were first found in the neorealistic cinema from Italy. The plots and the characters were used as vehicle for ideas. Of course, the ideology was so clear, so equal distribution of wealth among people. So, therefore, it was necessary to have characters and plot as vehicle, as kind of vehicle of ideas, and also for propaganda of certain kind of ideas. There was an emphasis on source sounds and avoidance of heavy musical scores. This is something we have been talking about, because all these things, heavy musical scores, they tell you what to feel. So, Italian neorealists, some filmmakers avoided the use of these devices, especially background music, manipulating emotions. In the late 1940s, Neorealism's influence spread to Hollywood, and actual locations where city as important character came into prominence, long takes to bring about a touch of a verisimilitude, in addition to using non-professional actors who added a touch of reality to the films. All these things influenced Hollywood as well. So, think a couple of movies like Jules Dessau's Naked City, and you will understand that those were the children of Italian neorealism or neorealistic cinema. Films of Satyajit Ray, for example, and Akira Kurosawa in Japan, and also avant-garde directors in Germany, Spain and Eastern Europe, they too were influenced by the movement. The first neorealist movie as we know it today is Obsession, 1942, directed by Luchino Visconti, who later directed another great movie called The Leopard, starring Burt Lancaster. It's a wonderful movie. So, Obsession is based on James M. Cain's, the American novelist, the writer of Pulp Fiction, the author of Mildred Pierce, The Postman Always Rings Twice. So, James M. Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice is the source for Visconti's Obsession. Major Italian neorealists were Roberto Rossellini. So, Rossellini is often referred to as the father of modern film by the critics of Cahiers du Cinema. Along with Renoir, he was the most influential name among the Nouvelle Vague filmmakers. His first three films are The White Ship, Plot Returns and The Man with the Cross. So, these are the films Rossellini made, and then he later on became one of the most influential directors of the Italian neorealism period. It was Rome, however, it was Rome Open City Aperita in 1945, which is regarded as one of the first major works of Italian neorealism, which cemented Rossellini's position as a foremost neorealist. Open City Rome weaves together a variety of stories of Romans during the occupation of Italy by the German forces. It conforms to all the dictates of the neorealist filmmakers, shot on locations, using non-professional actors, using long white takes, and working in sync sound, using natural lights. Rossellini's next film, Paisa, contains 6 vignettes from the liberation of Italy, and it is a chronicle of Italy from 1943 to 46. It was followed by Germany Year Zero, 1947, which is a devastating tale of defeat and solitude, and in one of the scenes a recording of a Hitler speech echoes over the apocalyptic landscapes. So, it is one of those first movies to use the idea of apocalypse. Yes, the end of the world is quite nearby, that is what the movie tells us. Together, Rossellini's films here, Open City Rome, Paisa and Germany Year Zero, they provide us with great commentary on the then contemporary social issues at a time of political movements of global importance. Okay. So, politics is always foregrounded in the works of Italian neorealists. It is more about content. Rossellini famously said, "I am not a pessimist. To perceive evil where it exists is, in my opinion, a form of optimism." So, you generally Italian neorealists and filmmakers like Rossellini were accused of being very pessimistic. They did not make escapist kind of cinema, but that is not the case according to Rossellini, and he said, in my opinion, to point out evil is a form of optimism. So, after a spate of neorealist films, he made several films with Ingrid Bergman and made several documentaries on and about Italy during this phase. So, he was also married to Ingrid Bergman for quite a while. Another important director of neorealist Italian period is Vittorio De Sica, who grew up in a lower middle class district of Naples and later on joined the stage. He began his career as a leading man in light-hearted romantic films, but soon took to direction. The other day we were talking about Max Ophuls' The Earring of Madame Da, and I was telling you that Vittorio De Sica played the role of Madame Da's admirer. Okay, so, he began his career as a romantic actor. Later on, his directorial ventures included a string of films which reflected his social commitment, thereby challenging the escapist fare of Italian cinema in the fascist era. So, along with Rossellini, De Sica was one of the most prominent voices against the fascist era. De Sica's Shoeshine in 1947 was scripted by Cesare Zavattini. He was also the writer of Bicycle Thieves, and Shoeshine is an account of the Shoeshine boys of the post-war Italy and was shot on real locations using non-professional actors. Our own Hindi movie Boot Polish, Raj Kapoor's movie, was inspired by De Sica's Shoeshine. Vittorio De Sica's most famous film, of course, is Bicycle Thieves, which is generally regarded as the film that heralded Italian neorealism. The plot is that an employed man played by Lamberto Maggiorani is forced to steal a bike and is caught by a crowd. Now, what makes the situation pathetic is the fact that the man's own bicycle, which is extremely crucial to his job of bill posting, is stolen. So, that is a commentary, that is a social commentary on Italian society of that period, that a man is prevented from earning an honest living. Okay. All that he needs is a bicycle, and you can think of the Iranian movie Children of Heaven, where what do the children desire? Just a pair of shoes. So, in a society where there is so much of disparity between the haves and have-nots, this is where crimes would originate. That is what the thesis is all about. So, the film is characteristic of the Italian neorealism with its use of non-professional actors and shooting on actual Roman locations, and famously it has influenced Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali and Iran's Children of Heaven, which was made in 1999. Let us talk about, from the neorealists we will move on to the Italian masters, and Federico Fellini is one of the most prominent names of this generation. So, Federico Fellini 1920 to 93, he was the son of a commercial traveler, and as a child he once ran away from home to join the circus. Back in Rome, he started his career as a cartoonist and illustrator. Fellini's early work reflects a preoccupation with human weakness for illusion and loneliness. In La Strada, that is The Road, in 1954, the film which won him international recognition, Fellini unfolds a tale of travelling circus, which was a recurring milieu in his works. Circus as a motif has been frequently employed by several great directors. Max Ophuls' Lola Montez, Raj Kapoor's Mera Naam Joker. So, circus as a metaphor. All the world is a stage. So, circus as a metaphor for our world has often been employed by filmmakers. Fellini's most popular film remains La Dolce Vita, which is an eloquent statement on life's excesses and the role of paparazzi. This is the movie that coined the word paparazzi in the modern times. It featured Marcello Mastroianni and Anouk Aimée and Anita Ekberg. It is a portrait of the decadent lifestyles of the rich and famous in Italy. The plot in La Dolce Vita centers on the exploits of a gossip journalist played by Mastroianni, who covers the beat of swinging Rome's party scenes. Along with his companion played by Anouk Aimée, Marcello travels in the exclusive set of the rich and the famous, and also the rich and the bored, even as he looks for some meaning in his life. This is a very existentialist theme, people trying to look for meanings in their lives, battling ennui, boredom, and that is the lives of the rich and famous is all about, according to La Dolce Vita. Fellini's another landmark movie is 8½, which was released in 1963, and it is a semi-autobiographical account of an artist's creative process. The film traces a film director, Guido Anzolini's, or perhaps Fellini's, since it is partially based on his own life, creative and personal life. So, with the plot goes as that there is a new project the director is about to start, and there is no script. So, the filmmaker has come to a dead end cul-de-sac, and Guido plumbs his memories of childhood and his hidden desires for inspirations. One of the famous lines in 8½, goes as, I have nothing to say, but I want to say it. Okay. Again, battling creative block, writer's block, or rather director's block, battling ennui and how to get over, how to find meaning in life, that is the theme. Originally it was titled A Beautiful Confusion, and Fellini takes us through a kaleidoscope of vivid and often outlandish images, hoping for his artistic burst. So, watch 8½, for the way he juxtaposes very dreamlike sequences with very real sequences. Okay, so, that is what the imagery is, what is important in Fellini. Most of his films are autobiographical, and they are all influenced by his life, his dreams, his passions, his own films, and his love for performative art. So, plenty of intertextuality, a terribly, terribly important filmmaker and very entertaining as well. Michelangelo Anthony, now this is another important filmmaker, an Italian master, 1912 to 2007. He began his professional life as a critic and was fired by Mussolini's regime for his leftist views. Before turning into an independent director, he contributed to the screenplay of Rossellini's A Pilot Returns in 1942. His early films such as the 1950 Chronicle of a Love Affair, influenced by Visconti's Obsession and The City, showed the influence of Neorealism and established his aesthetics of alienation. La Ventura, of course, remains his most important film, but Blow Up is also pretty well known. It was made in English, and another landmark movie, a movie that went on to influence a host of new wave directors across Europe and in Hollywood. Let me read you, and this is a book I often refer to, Roger Ebert's The Great Movies, and this is the first volume in which he reviews Blow Up. He says, Michelangelo's Antonioni's Blow Up opened in America 2 months before I became a film critic and colored my first years on the job with its lingering influence. It was a wake-up call for what Stanley Kaufman named the film generation, which quickly lined up outside Bonnie and Clyde, Weekend, Battle of Algiers, Easy Rider and 5 Easy Pieces. So, you see, along with all these Hollywood films, Blow Up, a British film, but directed by Antonioni, it became one of the key films of the new wave cinema, the counterculture movement. It was the highest grossing art film to date, was picked as the best film of 1966 by the National Society of Film Critics and got Oscar nominations for screenplay and direction. Young audiences aren't interested anymore in a movie about a trendy London photographer who may or may not have witnessed a murder, who lives a life of cynicism and ennui. This is an important concept in cinema of Antonioni, ennui. That's what L'Avventura is all about. And who ends up in a park at dawn watching college kids play tennis with an imaginary ball. The children of the audiences that bought tickets for Blow Up prefer ironic, self-referential slasher movies. Americans flew to swinging London in the 1960s. Today's Londoners pile onto chartered jets to Orlando. And that is how Roger Ebert introduces us to his introduction to Blow Up, which he feels was a movie, a path-breaking movie in several ways. And he continues, over 3 days at the University of Virginia, I revisited Blow Up in a shot-by-shot analysis. Freed from the hype and fashion, it emerges as a great film, if not the one we thought we were seeing at the time. This was at the 98 Virginia Festival of American Film, which had cool as its theme. The festival began with the emergence of the Beat generation and advanced through Cassavetes to Blow Up, after which the virus of cool leaped from its nurturing subculture into millions of willing new hosts and colored our society ever since, right down to and manifestly including South Park. Watching Blow Up once again, I took a few minutes to acclimate myself to the loopy psychedelic colors and the tendency of the hero to use words like fab. Then I found the spell of the movie settling around me. Antonioni uses the materials of a suspense thriller without the payoff. He places them within a London of heartless fashion photography, bored rock audiences, languid pot parties, and a hero whose dead soul is roused briefly by a challenge to his craftsmanship. So, that is what Blow Up is all about. People are often asked, what is Blow Up and what is it about, and no one really has the answer, and that is a characteristic quality of Antonioni. Next we will talk about Pier Paolo Pasolini, 1922 to 75. Widely respected as a poet, novelist and director, Pasolini is one of the most controversial and ambitious of filmmakers. His writings were scandalous and iconoclastic and celebrated the low lives of the Italian society. The low lives included pimps, prostitutes, hustlers, gamblers, thieves, and we are told that Pasolini often consorted with these people. One was his own socialist tendencies. No one was infra-dig, okay, no one was beneath him. So, he would not hang around with them. He also drew much of his creative inspiration from these people. Okay, it's often said that a writer should never lose track or lose touch with reality, with the ground reality of the society he lives in, and Pasolini is a supreme example of that kind of a filmmaker, the kind of author who never lost touch with the harsh realities of life. One of his most well known and successful films includes The Gospel According to Matthew 1964, which was filmed in the district of Basilica. It was shot in a totally neorealistic style without a screenplay. So, much of the shooting was improvised. Christ was a non-professional Spanish student of economics, and Mary at the time of crucifixion is Pasolini's own mother. The director uses simple cameras and minimal sets. So, it is a very minimalistic kind of movie, almost along the lines of a Dreyer movie, where actors are extremely real and locations and sets. So, it is not the MGM Cecil the Mill kind of a biblical movie. It is a very gritty, very realistic kind of a setting. And interestingly, music ranges, because Pasolini was extremely interested in experimenting with music also. So, music ranges between masses by Bach and Mozart, and also the blues. So, it is a combination, it is a collision of all kinds of music. Pasolini's Jesus is more along the lines of a messiah for the countercultural times and an angry young man. He is less of the religious figure and more a harbinger of the countercultural times. Okay, so, you can look at you can consider the references, the intertextualities at play here. Much of the dialogues in the film are in a debating style, where a question is answered with a question or a parable. The director's anti-capitalistic views are clearly felt, as Jesus often rebukes the rich and the powerful and condemns the materialistic society. So, often he is portrayed as Pasolini's own mouthpiece. Next director, Bernardo Bertolucci, 1940 he was born in, and still making films. So, Bertolucci started his career as Pier Paolo Pasolini's assistant, a movie called Hackathon, and later based his film Le Commence Cessa on a script by Pasolini. He gained recognition from Before the Revolution, which concerns a young man's inability to break away from his bourgeois values and fully commits himself to Marxist ideals. He is unable to actually fully commit himself to Marxist ideals. The Conformist is based on a novel by Alberto Moravia, and it explores the psychology of a young man who is hired by Italian fascists to assassinate his former professor in France. The film is an amazing study of tussle between authority and rebellion. We have been talking about the Conformist when we talked about Coppola's The Godfather. Okay, so, watch the Conformist and watch The Godfather, and perhaps you will find why Coppola regards Bertolucci so highly. Bertolucci's other famous works include Last Tango in Paris with Brando in 1972, The Last Emperor 1987, The Shattering Sky, The Little Buddha, and The Dreamers, which was released in 2004. Some other great works from Italy are Il Postino, Cinema Paradiso, which has been regarded as one of the most popular films from Italy during recent times. It is directed by Giuseppe Tornatore, 1988, and thus our interest in Italian cinema continues. Thank you.